Thank you again for the very kind invitation. Yesterday I said thank you for coming. Today I can say thank you for coming back, which is always a special treat. This talk is a bit different. The one yesterday was really a kind of historiographical overview. It was about method. It did use a specific case study to illustrate broader questions in the study of modern Israel. Today's talk is rather different in that it moves from the macro to the micro level, from prosopography to biography, the study of one individual. I try in my academic writings to move from one genre to another, and I've never written a biography. And when I was asked a couple of years ago to contribute the biography on Herzl for the Yale University Press Jewish Lives series, it's the 100 most famous Jews in world history. So I'm glad Herzl made the list. And at first I thought this would be actually a very easy thing to do, and then I realized it would actually be tremendously challenging because there are more biographies of Theodor Herzl than of any other political leader in Jewish history. A combination of Herzl's status in Israeli consciousness as the father of political Zionism, his personality and actions, and the times and the places of his life, the culturally rich fin de siècle in Western and Central Europe's great capitals, have made Herzl into a magnet for biographers. Committed Zionists are entranced by Herzl's turn from assimilation to nationalism and the greatness of his accomplishments as a Zionist leader during the decade before his untimely death. Critics of Zionism see in Herzl a prime example and a major source of what they believe to be Zionism's Eurocentrism and colonialism. Journalists are fascinated by Herzl's dramatic life story and psychological complexity. Intellectual historians see in Herzl a major contribution to modern Jewish political thought. Add to all this a vast and accessible body of source material, publicistic writing, published and exhaustively annotated diaries and letters, and immaculately preserved and cataloged archival documents, mostly in Western languages. And by the way, Herzl himself had very neat and legible handwriting. All of this is a recipe for a biographical feast. Every generation looks at the past in new ways and evaluates leaders in new lights. Only now, more than a century after Herzl's death, are we emerging from the cycle of hagiography and deconstruction, myth and counter-myth, that has characterized most of the writing on Herzl's life. It is time to bring to the study of Theodor Herzl the methods of cultural studies that present personal identities as fluid, shifting, and the product of self-fashioning. Selfhood is a matrix of forces, intellect and emotion, reflection and action, interiority and interaction. All being is social being, and political leadership depends upon and responds to its following. These truisms are especially relevant for Herzl, a man who was possessed of an extraordinarily frail ego and labile identity. A biography of Herzl for our time should shun a great man theory of history precisely because this approach would not in and of itself allow access to the secrets of Herzl's greatness. Herzl's Zionist vision was sincere and all-consuming, but for all of its appearance of solidity, Herzl was supremely flexible, and despite his flamboyance, he was intensely pragmatic. Biographical writing on Herzl so far has fallen into two varieties, hagiographic and deconstructive. The former typifies the biographies written by Zionist activists from shortly after Herzl's death until the 1930s and beyond. Most important among these was that of Alex Bein, first published in English in 1940. Alex Bein, a name that might not mean very much to people today. Alex Bein was the founder of the Central Zionist Archive, a genuine German Jew who had written his doctoral dissertation at Humboldt University under the directorship of Friedrich Meinecke on the subject of Alexander Hamilton's theory of the state. This was the Israel that I first knew when I lived there in the 1970s. The Israel still led intellectually by people like Alex Bein. In the work of Bein and others, there was a desire to portray Herzl as founder and inspirational figure of a struggling national movement that had not yet realized its goals. These works featured not only a reverential tone, but also an approach that stressed Herzl's actions over his ideas, or more precisely, action was presented as inspiring ideas, which then in turn inspired action. This overall approach has characterized some more recent work, most importantly, the pioneering and 3-volume Institutional History of Zionism, written by David Vital between 1975 and 1987. The first 2 volumes of this magnificent work contain abundant material about Herzl with an eye primarily towards the strengths and weaknesses of Herzl's qualities of leadership, but with little to say about Herzl as a human being, or the relationship between his humanity and leadership, or simply put, between culture and politics. During the 1960s and the 1970s, Israel gradually transformed from a pioneering state, idolizing one-dimensional national heroes, to a mature society whose intellectual elites strove to free themselves from ideological constraints. Cultural maturation was also at times accompanied by anger against the state's leaders, and by projection against its founders, for inculcating simplistic myths that justified aggression, war, and sacrifice. Amos Alon, author of a marvelous 1975 biography of Herzl, was among the first intellectuals to employ the term post-Zionist. He deconstructed the heroic visionary Herzl by restoring him to his fin de siècle European environment, demonstrating the chasm that divided this suave and cosmopolitan figure from the rough and tumble and somewhat parochial Jewish state. Elon was influenced by not only cultural developments within Israel, but also by a brilliant 1967 essay by the German historian Karl Schorsky that presented Herzl as an illiberal political impresario, like his anti-Semitic antagonists in fin de siècle Vienna, Georg von Schönerer and Karl Lueger, the ones about whom, as I mentioned yesterday, Herzl fantasized about fighting a duel. This critical approach would characterize much of the writing on Herzl for the next 25 years, leading up to what I think is the finest biography of Herzl, written by Ernst Powell in 1989. Powell appreciated the full spectrum of Central European influences on Herzl, and yet this biography did not adequately apply these insights to the story of Herzl's Zionist activity and its impact, mainly because Powell concentrated on Herzl's own writings and did not have access to Hebrew or Yiddish sources. And similar strengths and limitations characterized a marvelous book that is not as well known and deserves attention for any of you who are students of the subject by my colleague at the University of Toronto, Jacques Kornberg, a study of sort of the portrait of the Zionist leader as a young man, leading up to Herzl's Zionist awakening in the mid-1890s. Over the arc of time between Alon and Kornberg, between the 1970s and the 1990s, leftist movements throughout the world were increasingly distancing themselves from Israel and associating Zionism with the worst excesses of colonialism. This sentiment motivated Desmond Stewart's biography of 1974, which moved from deconstruction of hagiographical myth to the construction of new forms of counter-myths. So obviously I'm picking up on a theme that I discussed yesterday about the difference between a responsible counter-narrative and a propagandistic counter-myth. In Stewart's counter-mythical world, Herzl was an eager acolyte of Cecil Rhodes and envisioned the mass expulsion of the Palestinians from their native land, an issue I talked about yesterday. Despite the vast differences in tone or quality, though, between the work, say, of a responsible journalist, cum scholar like Elon and Desmond Stewart, this newer body of Herzl biography did share something in common, an emphasis on culture and context over leadership and action. Whether presented as a flawed hero, as Alon did, or a villain, as Stewart did, Herzl was seen as a product of a particular time and place, and the circumstances of his own highly troubled personal life also featured prominently. Herzl's pre-Zionist writings, particularly his plays, were examined as evidence of their author's psychological state. Earlier generations of Herzl's biographers had read his Zionist writings rather stolidly, as deeply reasoned political statements and blueprints for social engineering, whereas the newer scholarship saw them more as fantasies of power and control, displacements of existential and cultural conflicts from the old Europe to a land that could only exist in the imagination. This determination to remove Herzl from the pedestal of the visionary and to present him instead as a man lost in personal fantasy has continued to manifest itself in our own day in Israeli popular culture. In a song from the early 2000s by the Israeli hip-hop band Hadag Nachash, two Israeli time travelers, adolescents, journeyed to Basel at the time of the First Zionist Congress. The youngsters berate Herzl about Israel's desperate straits, only to learn, and by the way, there's a video of this easily available on YouTube. You just type in Hadag Nachash, Gabi Videbi, I think it is, right? Only to learn that Herzl is under the influence of hallucinogenic drugs, which he encourages the youth to ingest. He is mastul, he's stoned. Only to encourage the youth to ingest, saying, if you take it, it is no dream. Im tichachu, ein zo agada. It's obviously a pun on Im tirtzu ein zo agada, if you wish it is no dream, his famous mantra. In the face of these biting reappraisals and recontextualizations of Herzl, there's something rather anachronistic about the most recent biography of Herzl, published a few years ago in Hebrew by the distinguished scholar Shlomo Avineri, which is coming out in English very soon. I don't think we actually do Herzl justice by poring over his tract, The Jewish State, or his novel, Old New Land. I would actually rather see us focus on his vast body of journalistic and propagandistic writing, since Herzl was a journalist by profession and a propagandist by avocation. And so I'm seeking to create a new biography that transcends hagiography and incrimination, that presents Herzl not as a great thinker but as a great leader, an activist whose writings must always be read with their intended audience in mind. Herzl must be viewed from his own mind's eye, but also through the viewpoint of those with whom he dealt, particularly the Zionist faithful who revered him and reviled him. In recent years, it has become commonplace to present selfhood as subject to constant construction, of being a product of a dialectical process of interaction across time and space. Herzl was many things to many people, a screen onto which Jews projected their longings and aspirations. Herzl, an assimilated Jew, an insider and outsider within European and Jewish society alike. All of these factors enhanced his liminality, and thus the diversity of impressions of him. The authority of leaders derives from the trust, admiration, and even exaltation that they inspire in their followers, all the more so for political leaders, onto whom people project deep-seated unfulfilled longings, as is the case for leaders of movements for national liberation. The early Zionist movement was particularly dependent upon charismatic leadership because it was so small, weak, and scattered, utterly lacking mechanisms of patronage or means of coercion. Herzl had nothing to offer his followers but hope, and nothing to maintain their support other than their trust. For all that has been written on Herzl's charisma, his prepossessing persona and appearance, there's been little consideration of the cultural specificity of charisma. Had Herzl been dropped into a different era or continent, he might not have been charismatic or prepossessing at all. A biography of Herzl must be a study then of the social and cultural environments that allowed his particular personality and characteristics to be perceived as charismatic, his gestures as compelling. Under different circumstances, Herzl might well have been nothing more than a manic demi-intellectual, whiling away his days in cafes, scribbling feverishly in a diary, or today, writing something for the blogosphere. I'm aware of Herzl's powers of agency in the choices that he made. Herzl's provocative, flamboyant, and even outrageous political speech and acts were carefully orchestrated. In this sense, Herzl can be fruitfully compared with another great leader of Jewish origin, Benjamin Disraeli, whose claim to be the natural leader of the English gentry was even more baseless and staggeringly audacious than Herzl's pretension to be what he called the gestor, or the self-appointed guardian of the Jewish people. Biography of Herzl, then, is a study of leadership, with a particular focus on the complexities of Jewish political leadership at the fin de siècle. And as I mentioned yesterday, this is a project that's very much in utero. I'm doing the research for it now. And what I've done, in addition to sketching out the introduction, is I've isolated certain key themes that are going to feature in the book. So I'm going to, in the time that I have left, just simply outline some of these themes in a rather informal way. The first one, which might strike some of you as rather obvious, has to do with the role of the individual in history. I went to graduate school in the tail end of the Great Awakening of social history, when I cut my teeth on scholars like E.P. Thompson and the late Eric Hobsbawm, where we were taught essentially, not to think very much about great men in history, to think much more about social forces. And I was at a conference recently where a quintessentially American social historian, filled with verve and earnestness, said, "History is not about people, it's about structure." To which I thought, no, it's about people. In international relations theory, there is actually increasing room for people, for the role of leadership, particularly in situations of multiple and conflicting power structures and a lack of solid institutions. If an individual leader matters greatly in the international relations of a state, all the more so in a national movement of a stateless people, a movement whose institutions are rudimentary or absent, which has to be assembled from disparate points across a continent, or in the case of the Jews, across the globe. Now, I mentioned earlier charisma, which is another key word in this project, and that I want to spend a few moments talking about now. The word charisma obviously has many different meanings. In popular parlance today, charisma connotes charm, magnetism, and often sex appeal, the kind of attractive power that creates fans. But fans are not necessarily followers. The follower needs to be not just admirable, but to appear to understand her or his followers. The leader needs to understand her or his followers, to share, elicit, and enunciate their dreams and desires. This distinction between differing effects of leadership lies at the core of Max Weber's classic concept of charismatic authority. Charisma, literally the gift of divine grace, is associated by most readers with his works on ancient religion, in which he writes of the magician, the prophet, the judge, the biblical judge, the shofet, who rises and falls, and on the institutionalization, or in German, the Veralltaglichung of charisma, and the transformation of charismatic to legal authority. But in the essay where Weber developed the idea of charismatic authority, Politics as a Vocation, 1919, his main focus was on modern politics and on the charismatic as a component of a modern political system. Within the political party, wrote Weber, the charismatic leader inspires the cadres of activists, yet they follow him not only out of personal devotion, but also an expectation that he will deliver votes and patronage. Weber's concept of modern charismatic authority responded to the extension of the franchise in the United Kingdom after the Second Reform Bill in 1867. He attributes the creation of the modern party system to Joseph Chamberlain, but the first true modern charismatic leader for Weber was Gladstone, a master of what Weber called grand demagogy, able to command belief from the masses, I'm quoting Weber now, in the ethical substance of his policy and above all, their belief in the ethical character of his personality. Their belief in the ethical character of his personality. So was Herzl, in the Weberian sense, a charismatic? According to Weber, charismatic authority arises in their interstices between traditional and legalistic authority, between rabbinic Judaism on the one hand, and the law of the modern state, be it that of the diaspora or of the state of Israel, on the other. At a time when rabbinic authority had become increasingly unviable and modern secular state law failed to provide for the Jews' basic needs, there is room for charismatic authority. In the 20th century, charismatic authorities have frequently been dictators, responsible to no law but themselves. Herzl was at first such a leader, as he came from outside of the traditional centers of Jewish political power. He was not part of the rabbinocracy. He claimed authority as the gestor of the Jewish people to act on their behalf. He was self-appointed as the head of the Zionist organization and not subject to recall. And yet, paradoxically, Herzl created democratic institutions, the Zionist Congress itself and its executive, that allowed for parliamentary factions, such as the democratic faction of Eastern European secular Zionists, who immediately allied against him, the Mizrahi, the religious Zionists, and others. He helped create institutions which then went about striving to undermine or to act independently of his authority, such as the Jewish Colonial Trust, the Zionist Bank, and the Jewish National Fund. Ultimately, Herzl's power was constrained by the institutions he created, as seen by the notorious 1903 Zionist Congress that all but rejected his proposal to take up the British offer of territory for colonization in Kenya, often mistakenly called the Uganda proposal, because it was along the Uganda Railway, but it was actually in Kenya. Now, what of charisma in the more conventional sense of the word, a spellbinding, attractive power? Well, there's no doubt that Herzl had this kind of charismatic authority on the masses. The frequent claims by Zionist leaders and followers alike that Herzl appeared before them as the Messiah, or as Moses reborn. In Sofia in 1896, he was hailed by crowds as the Messiah. The same in Vilna in 1903, where crowds greeted him at the rail station with calls of HaMelech Herzl, King Herzl. Mordechai Ben-Ami, a Russian Jewish journalist, wrote at the time of the First Zionist Congress, "This is no longer the elegant Dr. Herzl of Vienna. It is a royal descendant of David, risen from the grave, who appears before us in the grandeur and beauty with which legend surrounded him. Everyone is gripped as if in a historical miracle that had occurred. It was as if the Messiah, the Son of Israel, stood before us." And the invocation of David is interesting because, of course, David, for Weber and many other scholars, is the archetypal charismatic authority. Even Orthodox Jews who opposed Zionism ideologically found in Herzl a spellbinding character. The leader of the Agudat Yisrael during the interwar period, Isaac Breuer, opposed secular Zionism, yet had an unswerving and lifelong belief in the greatness of Herzl's persona, his dedication, his purity of motive, the clarity of his goal, and his self-sacrifice. All these qualities then are word for word from Weber's definition of the charismatic authority's effect upon the modern masses in a political system. Even Herzl's ignorance of the Jewish tradition, Breuer found endearing, because only someone utterly removed from that tradition could be so bold and bald in his demand from the great powers that they give the Jews their homeland. And yet this charismatic authority only existed to the extent that followers were willing to grant it. As per the words of a young cultural Zionist, a colleague of Martin Buber's, a much lesser known figure named Bertolt Feivel, "In our earliest youth, Herzl signified all beauty and greatness. We, the young, had been yearning for a prophet, a leader. We created him with our longing." Herzl himself was aware of his charismatic powers and appeared a bit, but I think only a bit, uneasy with them. As he wrote after a meeting before a mass crowd in London's East End in July of 1896, "I am aware of how my legend is being born. A faint mist is beginning to rise and envelop me, and may perhaps become the cloud in which I shall walk." Now Herzl, in his vision, is not creating the mist. He's encapsulated by the effective field created by his followers. And Herzl, after all, was as likely to be derided as he was to be adored. When he would walk into the opera house in Vienna and greeted with catcalls of "King of the Jews," it was not meant as a compliment. So Herzl could be called HaMelech Herzl, seen as a messiah, or seen as a rather comical figure. Herzl was aware of the ambiguous quality of this charismatic, possibly charismatic authority. In his novel Alt Neuland, the opera being performed in one scene in the novel is a work about Shabbatai Tzvi, a symbol of the pre-modern Jews' superstitious longings for divine salvation, now replaced by self-improvement. Herzl himself claimed that unlike Shabbatai Tzvi, who elevated himself to greatness to appear alongside the great of the earth, Herzl, quote, "I find the great small as myself." So Herzl's charismatic authority then, I think whether we use the more traditional Weberian definition or a more, I'd say, colloquial definition, was great, but Herzl lived in the era before cell phones. And yet at the same time, Herzl was aware of the really the two-edged sword that charismatic authority carried with it. It could also carry derision and rejection. A second aspect of Herzl's life I need to examine in the biography is this notion of an invented persona. Herzl is a choreographer of the self. Herzl certainly did present himself. He cultivated an image of himself as great. He was identified instantly by his height, his impeccable dress, dark good looks, melancholy eyes, and above all, his dark Assyrian beard, as was often called his Assyrian beard. Many scholars have noted, and some have derided his self-fashioning. For example, there's a famous instance where Herzl was about to meet with Baron Maurice de Hirsch, and he writes in his diary that he had brand new white gloves he bought for the occasion, and he soiled them slightly so that the Baron would not suspect that he bought new clothes for the occasion. Right? Okay. Yes, Herzl scripted his appearance. He scripted the Zionist congresses, requiring evening dress for the delegates, choreographing the pageantry of the openings and closings, and the visions I discussed yesterday in his diary of the future states' flags and uniforms. Perhaps the most notorious form of Herzl's self-invention was his own creation in 1899 of a myth that survives to this day and cannot, it seems, be budged, that the Dreyfus trial had turned him to Zionism. It is simply not true. Herzl, at the time of the Dreyfus trial, did not protest Dreyfus's innocence. He did not protest the verdict himself. His turn to Jewish nationalism had come earlier, in 1894, when he wrote his play, The New Ghetto, a play filled with pathos, self-pity, and thanatos, in its tale of a heroic young Jew who dies at the hands of a corrupt nobleman. Remember the diary entry about longing to fight the duel? I mean, Herzl had a very strong death wish. Now, Herzl finished The New Ghetto 3 weeks before the trial began. In 1899, he wrote the play after the trial began. We have, the date at which the play was sent off to the Burgtheater. It was 3 weeks before the trial began. So why did Herzl create this legend? By 1899, the Dreyfus trial had created the Dreyfus Affair. It was a grand spectacle in which Jews were identified with the cause of liberalism and secularism. Herzl was a dramatist, and he appreciated the value of a conversion experience. But self-formation and a carefully scripted presentation of a larger-than-life persona is typical of pretty much any modern political leader. The best-known example, who I referred to earlier, was Disraeli. As Isaiah Berlin famously wrote, Disraeli was an actor, and he became one with his act. The mask became one of his features. Second nature replaced first. Disraeli was an adventurer and an exhibitionist, but he was not in politics or religion a cynic or a hypocrite. Disraeli was a would-be aristocrat who claimed ancient Italian origins, presented Jews as an ancient and noble race, anterior and superior to all existing aristocracies. Since being Jewish was a mark against him, he twisted it around and made it into a badge of honor. But Disraeli is only one of many political leaders we can discuss as being creators of their own personae. I would imagine that everyone in this room has seen the film Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, as some of you may know, was well aware of the effects that his haunting appearance had on his followers. He adored the theater, a bit too much. He loved political speaking as performance. And there was one peevish criticism of the film that was very upset with the playwright, Tony Kushner, for writing a lot of Shakespearean references into Lincoln's speech, saying Lincoln would never have been interested in Shakespeare, but of course Lincoln memorized almost the entire body of Shakespeare's writing, which was very popular on the American frontier among the lower and lower middle classes well into the 19th century. So another example, perhaps more useful example, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who often hid his disability but displayed it when appropriate for him, as when touring military hospitals in World War II, when he would roll in his wheelchair from bed to bed. More important, though, was FDR's self-invention as he deliberately developed his public persona, the pince-nez, the cigarette holder, the patrician laugh and thrown back head, the cape over the shoulder, all intended to create an appearance of lightness of being and to distract attention from his paralyzed lower half. The comparisons also can be made between Herzl and self-invented anti-colonial leaders or leaders of racial liberation movements. Muhammad Ali Jinnah was himself a great example of self-invention. The son of a humble merchant, a man who came from nowhere, who affected dandyish dress, white three-piece suits, two-tone shoes. And his opposite, Mahatma Gandhi, who also made a conscious choice to present himself in the simple loincloth, two radically different styles, yet both intended to impress the followers, as per the famous waspish exchange between the two, in which one accused the other of hypnotizing the Hindus, and the retort was, "But you are mesmerizing the Muslims." And then finally, an example of a anti-colonial or a liberation movement leader who carefully scripts his appearance, Martin Luther King Jr., like many black preachers in 20th century America, dressed meticulously, enunciated with the utmost articulation to appear dignified before his community, to serve as a model of acculturation and dignity and presentability, as well as self-pride. Herzl manipulated his audience, he exaggerated, he misdirected. Well, we all know that political discourse from Cicero onwards has emphasized all of these qualities. Now, Herzl's charisma and Herzl's persona were only some of his qualities of leadership. As I mentioned earlier, there's a vast difference between an actor who can have charisma and who, of course, invents his persona, and a leader. The great leader not only captures and represents human longings, but realizes those desires in order to transform the world as he or she knew it. There's a wonderful two-word phrase that Isaiah Berlin uses to describe the kind of project that a great leader can achieve, one that is antecedently improbable. I love that phrase because there very little was antecedently more improbable than the Zionist project. Now, Berlin observed that Herzl understood issues but not human beings, claiming that Herzl lacked Chaim Weizmann's ability to connect with and truly understand the masses. Other critics of Herzl have said the same, that he did not have the same sort of ability to connect as did, say, Irish leaders like Charles Stewart Parnell, or Czech leaders Jan Masaryk and Edvard Beneš, or the Polish 20th century leader Józef Pilsudski. And yet, I would think that it was precisely Herzl's otherness, as we saw in the case of Isaac Breuer, that made him so exciting. The notion of the Prince of Egypt, raised outside of the Jewish fold, who has undergone a conversion, which Herzl himself then embellished somewhat. So we have a tension then between two notions of leadership: the folksy leader, who works within the community, and the leader from the outside. And here's where we have to understand the relationship between Herzl and his public. Because by the time Herzl became a Jewish nationalist, a Zionist movement had existed for some 15 years. A movement led by a congeries of passionate, ambitious, vain, difficult, deeply intelligent, and articulate men. Mostly Ashkenazic and Eastern European, although some were Sephardic, like Moses Gaster here in England. The leaders of the Chovevei Tzion, the leaders of Zion, viewed Herzl with a mixture of veneration, envy, suspicion, and even derision. Herzl was derided by cultural Zionists who claimed he was a Jewish ignoramus. He was derided by practical Zionists like Menachem Usishkin, who insisted the Zionist movement engage in immediate settlement activity. He was constantly accused of being high-handed, failing to delegate authority, and possessing dictatorial aspirations. Disputes between Herzl and the Eastern European Zionists were in good measure ideological and cultural. So, for example, you can imagine the clash between an assimilated Western European Jew who in his early Zionist career held a meeting with Vienna's chief rabbi at Herzl's home while lighting the family Christmas tree. But the tense relationship between Herzl and his followers also reflected a complex blend of fealty and mutinous longing that characterizes the stance of lieutenants towards their commander. I'm just going to talk about one, I think, fascinating example of a failed Zionist leader, and the relationship between Herzl and him really embodying this kind of love-hate relationship. where Herzl commands loyalty, but also instantly and concomitantly arouses rivalry and envy. Nathan Birnbaum, a man who possessed Herzl's ambition and talent, but lacked the delicate and complex blend of qualities that transmute competence into greatness. While still a student at the University of Vienna, Birnbaum became a Jewish nationalist. He even coined the word Zionism in 1891. A fluid writer and intense orator, Birnbaum produced reams of thoughtful essays on the failure of emancipation and the uniqueness of the Jewish nation. It was Birnbaum in the early 1890s who urged that the scattered Zionist societies of his time unify in a robust political organization. At first, Birnbaum was entranced by Herzl and became his loyal deputy, but Birnbaum quickly grew to resent as much as he admired Herzl's charisma, his graceful prose style, his position of influence in the world of Central European journalism, and perhaps he envied Herzl's Assyrian beard. Like Herzl, Birnbaum had a restless mind and a troubled personality, although one that veered more towards simple narcissism rather than Herzl's tragic mixture of narcissism and manic depression. More on that in a moment. Birnbaum possessed considerable intellectual gifts and oratorical ability and ambition, but he lacked charm, and time again, he simply failed. Vain, brittle, blunt, and mercurial. He simply could not command a following the way that Herzl did. So the Eastern European Jews then absolutely revered him, and yet their reverence could not be separated from resentment and envy. Now, the last major topic I'm going to talk about has to do with his illnesses, mental and physical, because this is something that biographers have made a great deal of. Herzl was a most fragile leader. He suffered most likely from a congenital heart defect, either that or he acquired an autoimmune deficiency early in life that today we would diagnose as lupus. His physical frailty led him to fear that he had limited time. Herzl threw himself into his political work, and by the way, this is not so unusual. After all, when you think of the huge toll that polio took on Franklin Delano Roosevelt's body, and may have been one of the many things that contributed to his uncontrollable hypertension, which caused his death. American President John F. Kennedy, as I think we all know, suffered from a serious adrenal deficiency known as Addison's disease, which might very well have killed him had he not met an untimely end in 1963. Illness can push a man on to greatness as easily as it can reduce him to a depressive paralysis. It is Herzl's neuroses, though, more than his physical illnesses that attract the most attention. Herzl was cursed by both mood and personality disorders. He suffered manic depression. We see that he wrote The New Ghetto and The Jewish State in bursts of manic exaltation. He was a narcissist, unable to love others, sexually stunted, unhealthily attached to his mother, deeply misogynist, as seen in his private life and in his public writings. The depictions of women in Herzl's writings are really quite horrific. Herzl loathed his wife, Julie, who appears to have crossed the line from neuroses of the more mild sort into a full-blown borderline personality disorder. In fact, if you look up the DSM criteria for borderline personality disorder, Julie Herzl met every single one of the criteria, including histrionic behavior, manipulativeness, self-harm, risky behavior, extravagantly wasteful with money, fear of abandonment. I mean, it's not a pleasant story. Herzl himself was obsessed with fears of cowardice, with a desire to be manly, to compensate for his own physical limitations in order to overcome anti-Semitism. As a young man, he berated himself for what he called an unhealthy surfeit of feeling. I don't know if that meant his compassion or his sexual passion. This is something I've seen in a memoir, an unpublished diary of the young Arthur Rupin, who became a Zionist leader, who was obsessed with shame over what he called his Sinnlichkeit, which simply meant that he was a young man who had normal male urges. Herzl joined an aggressively German nationalist fraternity in Vienna. He deeply admired the Prussian aristocracy, which he identified with manliness, stolidity, courage, and boldness, which would be manifested in daring political action. As he wrote in his diary when he was a young man, "If there's one thing I should like to be, It is a member of the old Prussian nobility. Herzl despised Austrian Schlampferei, a kind of a muddling quality. It irked him. But at the heart of his social critique lay his obsession with anti-Semitism, which at first he blamed actually on Jews. He blamed on Jewish plutocrats, seeing himself as a virtuous pariah rather than a parvenu. And yet Herzl at the time lacked the benefit of having read Hannah Arendt's essay on the parvenu and the pariah, because Arendt would not write it for some half a century. Despite profound ambivalence about his Jewishness, Herzl was too proud to change his name, let alone convert. Bedeviled by anti-Semitism, he seriously considered mass baptism for the Jews, and even raised the idea with his superiors at the Neue Freie Presse, and asked that the Pope be solicited to launch an anti-Semitic campaign in return for Jewish mass conversion. Now, Herzl's fantasies of mass baptism of the Jews at the Stephanskirche in Vienna is often invoked as evidence of Herzl's self-hatred and even mental imbalance. Mad as it may have been, it was not a product of self-hatred or of Jewish anti-Semitism, because Herzl himself vows not to convert. He says he would remain Jewish out of filial loyalty and manly pride. He was not truly assimilationist in that, unlike earlier offers or acts of conversion by famous Jews in the German-speaking world, like David Friedlander or Heinrich Heine, Herzl proposed a conversion that would preserve Jewishness, as this would be a willful act of masses of Jews whose identities could not help but be preserved despite the nominal change of faith. Although Herzl saw in mass baptism a possible solution for the Jewish question in Austria, he had a very different solution for Germany. Because of the strength of his Social Democratic Party, he thought the answer to the Jewish question in that country lay in socialist revolution. In 1892, as a correspondent in Paris, he covered the trial of the anarchist bomber Ravachol, whom Herzl was deeply impressed by, as he called the voluptuousness of the anarchist's great idea, the clarity of purpose, his courage, his honesty, his boldness of vision. So as disturbing as Herzl's neuroses may have been, they don't account for the specific forms that his political vision and activity assumed, much less the successes of his endeavor. So by means of conclusion, we need to think about, at the end of the day, what matters about Herzl, however titillating the personal aspects of his life might be, was the fact that he succeeded at being a statesman. He specifically chose to become a Jewish nationalist and to espouse a program of bold and public diplomatic activity. He founded an international Jewish parliament and related institutions that operated according to the rule of law, internally and with respect to the international community. Yes, as a young man, he fantasized about dueling, and he had very strange attractions as an adult to prepubescent girls and so forth, but I think more of the Lewis Carroll variety than of anything more what would be the word, more illegal than that. But as a young man, in the midst of all of these fantasies, he also wrote a play about Girolamo Savonarola, the great Florentine demagogue. He was a man, even as a young man, filled with interests in social reform. He was fascinated by utopianism and technophilia, with electricity, the railroad, and the telegraph. Herzl wrote a book called The Jewish State, but he was not a power-hungry would-be dictator. He had no interest in commanding a state. In both his pamphlet and his novel Altneuland, the state is merely a means to an end, the end being a model society, peaceful both internally and in relations with its neighbors. It achieves a middle way between rapacious capitalism and stultifying socialism. Herzl himself brought an economist, Franz Oppenheimer, into the Zionist organization to preach the benefits of cooperative agricultural settlements. Some people believe that Herzl's elision of the state in his writings was a kind of a trick, a means of assuring the Ottoman Empire that he did not wish to seize its territory. I believe more that Herzl was a product of a multinational empire in which there were many gradations between statelessness and sovereignty. Hungary, after all, was a state of a sort within the dual monarchy. Herzl sought autonomy, not sovereignty. As he said at one of the Zionist congresses, the Jews are not a political power, and they never again will be a political power. Herzl also wrote, a colony is a small state, and a state is a large colony. There is a trend in historiography that says that Herzl was nothing more than a latter-day Stadlan, an intercessor, pleading with the great powers to provide them with financial benefit in return for granting the Jews favors. I don't think this is accurate. Herzl did not act as an individual interceding on behalf of a community. He was the self-proclaimed representative of a Jewish collectivity whose boundaries could not be clearly defined because he claimed to represent the Jewish people as a whole. Herzl orchestrated elections to the Zionist Congress based on universal adult suffrage, men at first, but then in 1898, women as well, at a time when New Zealand was the only country in the world that had female suffrage. So this notion of Herzl as an intercessor ignores the fact that he developed a mass movement on whose behalf he was interceding. This is not the same thing. And also, Herzl's activity was public, bold. In fact, so bold that Russian Zionists found him quite an embarrassment, and they were quite concerned about the possible impact of his activity on the situation of Jews in Russia and in the Ottoman Empire. In that sense, he was the opposite of a Stadlan, because his whole sense of manliness was dependent upon publicness, or Öffentlichkeit, to use the Habermasian terminology. Herzl then was the leader of a stateless people who embodied and transcended the spirit of his age. Like Griffith and Parnell, Masaryk, Smuts, even Gandhi, he was a man from the professional classes of academics and lawyers, most of whom came from the outside, Herzl coming from the outside, living comfortably in the world of the colonizer. Parnell as a Protestant and half American. Smuts as a Boer with English education. These leaders had national philosophies that bore a strong family resemblance. Herzl's vision of a Jewish self-sufficient society, Arthur Griffith, the founder of Sinn Féin, imagining a practical economic national reconstruction. The leaders, whether it be the Irish, the Czechs, the Jews, established national parliaments in Ireland going back to O'Connell in the mid-19th century, who organized nationalist groups with weekly dues and regular meetings. The Zionist Congress was to Zionism what the founding of the Congress Party in 1885 was to the Indian anti-colonial movement. All of these leaders had to unite a deeply vociferous people. In Ireland, Parnell brought together moderates and Fenians, supporters of the Land League and of repeal, just as Herzl brought together the Orthodox and the secular, East and West. It's interesting how these leaders had to blur the question of the final goal, the end seal, in order to win a following. And all of these leaders of stateless peoples, turned to the international community for legitimization and protection, to the League of Nations after World War I and its inchoate predecessors in the era of Herzl and his contemporaries. Smuts, Masaryk, and Beneš, like Herzl, all argued for their utility to the great powers. In World War I, it was the Czech nationalists who argued that they would serve the Allies in their struggle against the Central Powers. For Smuts and Parnell, loyal support for Great Britain. Herzl and Weizmann were then, I think, in good company. Yes, Herzl had to constantly adjust to his followers, thus his sudden conversion where he attends synagogue in Basel on the eve of the First Zionist Congress and has an aliyah, probably the first time since his bar mitzvah. His pious reference to halakha in a letter to the religious Zionist leader Moalever, or his protests of undying love for Eretz Israel throughout the Ugandan controversy. As Winston Churchill famously said, it is the followers who truly lead, and Herzl was able to inspire a following. Thank you.